Okay, thank you very much. And as Mario said, I'm speaking to you from Australia, my study at home in Canberra, Australia. And my topic then is becoming a high reliability organization, a practical approach. So let me just begin by defining what I mean by a high reliability organization. These are organizations which operate in highly hazardous environments, but do so without ever having an accident or almost never having an accident. So some of the examples which are used in these discussions are nuclear power stations, which operate in almost entirely accident-free fashion, American nuclear aircraft carriers. These are organizations which have been studied and written about. Nuclear submarines, US nuclear submarines are probably the best example of a high reliability organization, and also air traffic control functions in this manner. So those are some of the organizations that have been studied as examples of high reliability organizations. Now I'm going to share my screen with you. So I hope this is going to work. So I hope you can see my screen now. So let's talk a little bit more about how these organizations are characterized. We want to characterize them. And I think we can characterize them as having a state of organizational mindfulness. Another word for mindfulness is risk awareness. Okay, so we're talking about an organizational characteristic. We're not talking about individual level characteristics initially. Of course, the end state is the desired state is organization, mindful individuals. But we're not just talking about collections of mindful individuals. We're talking about organizational phenomena. We're talking about organizational practices that are mindful. And so if we think about what that means, what is a mindful organizational practice? It is a practice which is based on the premise that something may be going wrong or something may be about to go wrong. And the practice is designed to identify what that is and to really seek out what may be going wrong. So these are truly organizational practices, and HROs exhibit a lot of those practices. Another expression for that that's often used is chronic unease. HROs exhibit chronic unease, that is a sense of uncertainty about unease, meaning uncertainty about whether they have those hazards under control, and chronic, meaning long-term. That's the state of mind of the whole organization, and hopefully it's also the state of mind of its leadership. Now, the key to becoming an HRO is the idea of warning signs. Why is that? It's because prior to every major accident, there are always warning signs which were ignored. Warnings of what was about to happen, which had they been identified and responded to, the accident could have been prevented. Now that's really what this whole talk is about. It's about being aware of these warning signs and identifying them and responding to them. I'll just give you one quick example from work that I've done. It was a gas processing plant in Australia, an Exxon plant, and the accident which happened was that a large metal steel heat exchanger, a large tank, which was normally too hot to touch, became suddenly very cold with ice on the exterior. And this was something unusual. Operators recognized that something was wrong, and they tried to warm it up by injecting some warm oil into this very cold vessel. But what they didn't understand was that the vessel had become brittle with cold. Steel if it gets too cold, it can become brittle. And just as with a cold glass, if you pour boiling water into a cold glass, it can shatter. The same thing can happen with very cold steel. It can shatter if you try and warm it up too quickly. And that's what happened. It shattered, and flammable material went everywhere, and there were many deaths and injuries. Now, the tragedy is that something very similar happened a month earlier. The operators, the vessel, the heat exchanger became very cold, but on this occasion, it didn't get to that brittle state, and the operators were able to warm it up without it shattering. So something had gone wrong. They fixed it up. It was a clear warning that something was wrong. It was what I would want to call an anomaly. An anomaly is something which we don't understand, something it shouldn't be like this, but we don't understand it. But nothing actually happens, nothing serious happens, and so we ignore it. This was an anomaly, and they ignored it. They didn't understand it. Had they identified this as a problem and studied it, then the accident wouldn't have happened a month later. So this is the kind of warning sign that I'm so interested in, and this is why it's so important that we identify these warning signs. There are all kinds of warning signs, and it's important to be, if you have a risk-aware mindset, you will be aware of these warning signs when they happen. Now, there is, I just want to make the point, a fashionable theory that not all accidents are preceded by these warning signs. Some accidents are unpredictable, unforeseeable, inconceivable to the senior management, because they say, well, we have all these systems in place, so we're fine. We can't imagine an accident happening in this context. And these have been called black swan accidents. It's a very interesting metaphor. The metaphor, it stems from the fact that in Europe, before Europeans had ever set foot in Australia, all swans were white. The only swans which had ever been seen were white. The idea of a black swan was inconceivable, unpredictable, unknowable. But when Europeans set foot in Australia, they saw these black swans for the first time. And the idea is that there are accidents like that, which are unknowable beforehand, unimaginable to the people concerned. Interestingly, if you take that metaphor a step further, you come to a very different conclusion. And that is that while those black swans had not been imagined by Europeans, they were well understood by the indigenous inhabitants of Australia, because Australia is full of black swans. And from that point of view, I think we can think about accidents in a different way. These accidents may be inconceivable to senior managers, but there are always people at the grassroots of the organization who are aware that things are going wrong. They're aware of the potential warning signs, but they just don't report them. For various reasons, they don't report them. And if we understand the black swan metaphor in that way, it is absolutely consistent with what I am saying, that prior to major accidents, there are always warning signs which are ignored. So the point then is that HROs are very aware of these warning signs. I'm going to shift my language now from warning sign to bad news. Those things mean the same thing, but it's more helpful to talk about bad news in what follows. So HROs are organizations that encourage the reporting of bad news. Generally speaking, it's only good news that moves up the organizational hierarchy. And HROs are very aware of that problem, and so they encourage the reporting of bad news. I want to give a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. The first one comes from the petroleum company Shell. Shell, no company can really claim to be an HRO, but Shell, parts of Shell at least, have come close to it. And the management of Shell was very much concerned to encourage the reporting of bad news. I spoke to a manager. I was sitting in the office of a senior manager of Shell one day, and she was engaged in a project to encourage the reporting of bad news in her part of the organization. And as I sat in her office, she was on the phone to a lower level manager. And she said to him, "Thank you for the report. Thank you for the report that you have written with all this good news in the report. But where is the bad news? Can you please rewrite your report to include the bad news?" So she was actively encouraging the reporting of bad news. There's a very, by this stage, very famous slogan. I think it's really Shell who first introduced this slogan, but other companies around the world now use it. Challenge the green and embrace the red. It's a traffic light concept, and many companies have a dashboard where they want to array the status of all their risks on a single dashboard for the senior management, so they can see where the risks lie. And if the risk is under control, then that light is green. If there's currently a problem, it's red. If it's in between, it's orange or amber. And so senior management wants to see as many greens as possible, and they want to get rid of the reds as fast as they possibly can. That's what senior management wants. And the meaning of this slogan reverses that and says, we don't want to just accept the greens, we need to challenge the green. How do you know that the risk is really under control? What is the data on which this is based? Is it adequate data? So challenge the green and embrace the red. The red is telling us something is wrong. Let's not try and get rid of it too quickly. Let's study it closely and learn as much as we can from it. Let us embrace it. Learn as much as we can from it. And only then should we convert the red to the green. So that's the attitude which Shell was trying to encourage. That's the attitude of an HRO. One of the best examples of HROs, as I think I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, is, let me just close this, American nuclear submarines. And there's a wonderful book that I want to refer you to. Now, something is just happening with my screen. There we are. Okay, this is a book written about the US nuclear submarine culture. And it's really celebrating the way in which that culture operates and drawing lessons from it for other organizations. So here is the quote that I want to I think is really very telling. One of the most amazing elements of the nuclear submarine culture is its self-enforced refusal to sweep problems under the rug. For decades, submarine culture has recognized the criticality of squeezing out every ounce of lessons learned from imperfect performance. Okay, imperfect performance is the bad news. We're going to squeeze out every ounce of lessons that we can from that bad news. So that's the way the US nuclear Navy works. And that's why, particularly the submarines, apart from the first nuclear submarine accident in the early 1960s, there hasn't been, the US hasn't lost a nuclear submarine since. That's 60 years without losing another submarine. So that's what the aim is, to access this bad news in all kinds of ways. Now, HROs have systems for identifying and responding to bad news, and I want to talk about this in more detail. And I'm going to talk about air traffic control, which I have studied. Particularly, this will be in Australia. I've studied air traffic control in Australia. These organizations operate with remarkable reliability. If you think about what is the job of air traffic control, it is to avoid mid-air collision, avoiding mid-air collision. And the mid-air collisions are incredibly rare, which is a demonstration of how effective air traffic control is. Unfortunately, they have occurred from time to time, but they are incredibly rare. So air traffic control in Australia and elsewhere is very interested in this question of reporting. And they operate two reporting systems. The first one is for reportable incidents. The company has said, the organization has said to all airlines, there are certain things you must report to us. In fact, by law, you must report these things. For example, what is called a runway incursion. That is when an aircraft without authorization enters a runway, an active runway, that is a runway on which aircraft are taking off and landing. It's called a runway incursion, and clearly a very dangerous event. That's the kind of event which must be reported. And there are about half a dozen other events which must be reported. And of course, people do all report those things. But what else? There are many other things which need to be reported and are not. But the problem with a compulsory incident reporting system is that the first question that people ask when they're faced with an incident, first question they think about is this an incident which I must report? And if the answer is yes, then they will report it. But if the answer is no, then they don't report it. Now that is not logical. They can report all kinds of things, but the natural state of mind is, if this is not something we must report, then we don't report it. And so the way they get around that in the air traffic control world is to have this second reporting system, which is for events with safety implications. And this is something clearly you cannot specify beforehand what all events with safety implications are, but you want your workforce to be aware of these possibilities and to report them and to take the initiative to report them. So let me give you an example of one of these things which happened to the air traffic control operations in the city of Adelaide, which is one of the big cities in Australia. One night, they were the air traffic controllers. There's supposed to be 4 of them on duty at that air traffic control center. One of them was sick and couldn't come into work. There should have been a replacement, but they couldn't find that replacement. And so they had to operate short-staffed all night. Now, there were no incidents, there were no near misses, no aircraft came closer to each other than they should have been, but the level of risk was higher because there were fewer controllers on duty that night. And so the next morning at 5 a.m., the controllers filed a report into this event with safety implications reporting system. The fact that they were understaffed was an event with safety implications. They filed that at 5 o'clock in the morning. It went immediately via the internet to head office in Canberra, which was the way the system worked. There were safety experts at head office in Canberra who analyzed, look at all these reports that come through, prioritize them, and act on them if need be. That one was acted on. It went to the morning meeting of the board of the organization. That morning at 8 a.m., 3 hours after the report was made, it went to the management board of the air traffic control organization for consideration. And the board took it so seriously that they commissioned an independent inquiry into what had gone wrong and what needed to be done. So that's an example of the way in which this safety events with safety implications system is used and how the organization responds to it. So if we think for a moment of all the things that have safety implications but don't get reported, there are many, many of them. And I want to mention just a few of them, just to encourage your thought processes. What are the things which get missed in conventional reporting systems, which might be picked up in the kind of system I'm talking about? Process upsets. Many of you will be familiar with the concept of a process upset. The Exxon gas plant accident, the cold temperature incident that I spoke about earlier, was an upset in the process. It was a process upset. Clearly, those things need to be reported. Maintenance being deferred. How often does that get reported into an incident reporting system? Very seldom, but it needs to be, because it is an indication of increasing risk. Machinery in dangerous condition obviously needs to be reported. Corrosion. Corrosion is a very interesting one because it's not an event, it's a state. But if people become aware of corrosion, they need to be able to report it, because corrosion is one of the is a contributing factor to many, many accidents. Isolation failures, that's another very interesting one. When people start work on a piece of equipment, they need to, if they're doing maintenance work on it, they need to make sure that they've disconnected or isolated the electrical energy and the mechanical energy. Too often, maintenance workers begin work without having made those isolations. They suddenly realize, oh my God, this machine is still live. They step back and they isolate it, and then they do the job. Now that's a near miss. It's the kind of thing which needs to be reported, but very seldom are those sorts of isolation failures reported into systems. Inappropriate procedures, a very common one. What do workers do when they encounter inappropriate procedures? Far too often they just work around those procedures and devise their own. What they need to do, and what the organization needs to encourage them to do, is to report immediately that the procedures are inappropriate, and the organization needs to respond actively, immediately, to correct those procedures. Excessive overtime, this is obviously a factor, and I won't dwell on that. Understaffing, I've already given you an example of that. Poor ergonomic design is another interesting one. For example, if operators are required to read a dial, and the dial can only be read by climbing a ladder, then of course those operators are not going to climb that ladder as often as they perhaps need to. So that's an example of poor design, poor ergonomic design. By ergonomic, I mean the interaction between human and machine. That's a very poor design for the interaction between human and machine. And most importantly, anomalies. Anything which we don't understand, it's wrong, it shouldn't be like this, but we don't understand, needs to be reported. That's a challenge for reporters, because they don't understand it, it's not so clear what it is they're reporting or why they should be reporting. And this is why it's so important that people have that sense of risk awareness, which will be generated by in the context of HROs, so that everyone is aware of anomalous events and the need to report them. Okay, let me say a bit more about how we can encourage people to report these anomalies and other things, other bad news. How can we encourage this? I want to give a couple of examples of how we encourage it. The most important thing is we celebrate it when the organization must celebrate these reports when they are made. There's a very wonderful example of this in the literature that some of you will have read about. It concerns the US nuclear aircraft carrier. Now, a maintenance worker thought he might have left a tool on the deck of the aircraft carrier. He wasn't sure he had, he couldn't find the tool. He might have left it on the deck. Very dangerous event in the context. Any foreign object on a runway is a very dangerous event, a very dangerous incident. So the worker reported this to the commanding officer of the aircraft carrier. There were aircraft in the sky at the time. They had to be diverted to a shore base. The tool was then found. Those aircraft were then brought back on board. So this was a major disruption to the activities of the aircraft carrier. The next day, the commanding officer summoned his crew, called his crew to the deck of the carrier and had a ceremony where he congratulated that man for having made that report. Two things to notice about that report. First of all, it was a very helpful report because it helped the organization avoid a major accident. And second thing to notice about it, it was a courageous report because that worker was reporting on his own carelessness, or what might be seen as his own carelessness. But nevertheless, although he recognized this report might put him in a bad light, he recognized it was important for the safety of the whole organization that he make that report. The second example I want to mention comes from the Shell again. I've done a lot of work with Shell, and so some of my examples come from Shell. The Shell manager I spoke about before had introduced a system of rewards for people who were reporting bad news. So she had, I think the top level award was a platinum award, then a gold award, then a silver award. And those awards had associated with them a reward, and a platinum award was attracted $1,000 reward. Now, companies often say, we can't possibly give that amount of money for making a report. But this is a way that large amounts of money are a way of recognizing and symbolizing the importance of reporting this sort of information. Now, in this case, the manager had just made an award, a platinum award, the highest level of award, because a plant operator had written an email to his immediate boss saying that the operating limits of his equipment had been changed without going through the required management of change process. And those of you who are familiar with these issues will know that's a very serious matter. If you change the safety limits, the operating limits of a piece of equipment, you must go through the management of change process. That hadn't happened. So the operator wrote this email. It went to his immediate manager, was passed up the line to the senior manager who I was talking to, and she made that award because that was such a helpful and also courageous report. Because it was courageous because this person who made the report really had no idea whose toes he might be stepping on. Okay, so in summary then, what organizations must do is encourage helpful reporting and courageous reporting. So I want to now use those ideas to help you design a bad news reporting system. And everything I'm now going to talk about, I have seen myself in various companies, or I have read about operating in various companies. So there's nothing new about any of this, but putting it all together in a model is a useful thing to do. I don't think I've seen any one company doing everything I'm talking about here, but it's the model which HROs aspire to and should aspire to. The first thing is to make reporting easy. too often making a report requires the reporter to go to a computer screen and bring up an Excel spreadsheet and enter a whole lot of data, classify the incident. They may not find it easy to classify the incident, risk assess the incident. They may find that very difficult to do indeed, to risk assess it. So those are all impediments to reporting. So we must make it easy. And the simplest way to make reports is to have an app on a phone or an iPad, which is easily accessible to everybody. They understand this technology. This technology these days, everyone understands. And they can, on this app, they can just make a quick report, a written report about what they saw. They may have some ideas about what should be done, recommendations. They may want to attach some photographs, and that report goes off in their text, their free text. They don't have to satisfy the boxes of the spreadsheet. That's their own words, what go forward. And that makes it so much easier for them to do. The second thing is, where do those reports go? They must not be allowed to be buried within a system. They must be directed to the appropriate people. And they must automatically go to the appropriate people. So this is a little diagram which shows what should happen to these reports. If a worker makes a report, it will usually go to the supervisor, and many of those reports can be responded to by the supervisor, and there is no further need for any action, but many will need action at higher levels. So a copy of the report must go automatically to the site manager or some higher person in that line, so they can see what is going on in that business unit. Also, the report must go quite outside of the business line, outside of this business line. It must go to a separate report analysis center automatically, as I described with the air traffic control. So it goes to the center, is prioritized. Some of those reports will go higher to a corporate risk manager who needs to be a high-level executive in the organization who answers directly to the CEO. That's very important, because sometimes the only real solution to the problem which the worker has identified is to spend millions of dollars. And it's only if that recommendation comes through from a high-level manager that may be done. So that's the kind of reporting system which I'm advocating based upon what happens in air traffic control. And then the next issue is what happens about that. Okay, the report back process. Workers must be provided with a report back. If they don't get any kind of response, if it just gets lost in the system, they will never make another report. So there has to be a report coming initially from the supervisor. Thank you for your report. This is what we're going to do about it. We can't make a decision now. It may need to go to the site manager for a decision, or I'm going to, supervisor may be able to resolve the matter straight away. But there must be a report back to the worker. And that copy of that report goes to the site manager and goes to the report analysis center, so everyone can see what is going on. Now, the next part of the system I want to talk about is an absolutely vital step in this process, which is to encourage helpful and courageous reporting. How do we actually encourage it? There are a couple of problems which must be overcome to encourage it. Helpful reporting. The first problem is that you set up a system and you may not get any reports. So we've got to find a way to start the process going. And the second problem is there may be far too many reports which are not particularly helpful. Reports of the type that the grass needs cutting. Now, those reports need to be responded to respectfully. but they are not the sort of reports which are going to help you avoid a significant accident. So these are some of the problems which the reporting system must do. We must first of all encourage people to report, and we must steer the reporting system towards the most helpful reports. I'm using that word steer quite deliberately. It's a steering in the same way that you steer a large ship. We have to steer the reporting system in the required direction to highlight bad news that's going to help us avoid big accidents. How do we do that? I think the best way to do it is to have a regular competition for the most helpful reports. So each site, maybe every month or every 3 months, will have a competition for the most helpful report of that period. What does helpful mean? Well, you have a judging panel to look at these reports that have come through and decide which has been the most helpful in avoiding a major accident at that particular site. So that's a judgment which has to be made. And that decision is then, the announcement is made by the manager of that site saying, this was the most helpful report of the reporting period, because it helped us avoid this kind of major accident. So everyone is thinking about, what is the purpose of the system, and how can we fine tune it in the required direction? And over time, that happens every reporting period, every month or every 3 months. There is this feedback about what has been the most helpful report, and that person, by the way, gets a reward, a significant reward, $1,000 perhaps. And over time, people get the message of the kinds of things which are being rewarded and the kinds of things which are not. And that will steer your reporting system in the direction of the most relevant hazards in your particular organization. So the interesting thing to notice about what I've just described is it's a system which focuses on the quality of the reports and not on the quantity. There are many organizations which encourage people to report safety observations, and there are often quotas. We need so many reports per month, and so people make those reports, but they can be quite trivial, unimportant reports. So that's a system which focuses on quantity. But what I'm describing is a system which is focused on the quality of those reports. And that's an extremely important aspect of this. We don't want a large number of reports. If you have a large number of reports, it will swamp the system. We just want a continuing stream of reports, enough for us to be able to focus on the most significant hazards, but not to overwhelm our system. Okay, and I think to encourage this kind of courageous reporting, the system must be a no blame system. There must be immunity for the reporter and anybody about whom a report is made. Now, what I've just said is an absolute no blame system is what is required. Many organizations will resist that. They will say, no. We are operating what we call a just culture system. And we reserve the right to punish people for things which we think are particularly blameworthy. We won't punish everything, but we reserve the right to punish some things. Any just culture system like that is not going to work. So it has to be an absolutely no blame reporting system. And by the way, you must include all contractors on site in this system. It's very important that everybody working on site is free to contribute to the system and is encouraged to contribute to the system. For very often it's the contractors working on site who are most aware of the bad news, and they're the ones who may be in greatest need of encouragement. Okay, so I think if you've got a reporting system like this in operation in your organization, not only does it get at the bad news, not only does it pick up the warning signs, but it has a number of other very useful features. It creates a culture of ownership, whereby people feel that their opinion is valued, and they participate in the common goals of the organization. It undermines the alienation which workers can so easily feel in those situations. It promotes risk awareness because people are being rewarded for risk awareness, for being mindful. It promotes a richer conversation about risks because every time there is, at the end of the reporting period, a judgment has to be made about which was the most helpful report of the period. And that promotes a conversation about risks. And it's an ongoing conversation. So over the many reporting periods, it refines the understanding of what are the risks which are most important in this context. And that's what it means to be a high reliability organization or a learning organization. These terms all mean much the same thing, or a mindful organization, or a generative. I'm not going to talk about the meaning of that term now. I haven't got time. But that's what it means to be a high reliability organization. So I think I'm going to stop there, but I'm going to recommend to you, if you want to follow up on this, what I've been saying, you can go to this guide, which has been translated, which you people have translated into Spanish to read what I've been talking about in your own language. So thank you very much.